Hello, good afternoon, guys. Very warm welcome back to you all. Trust you had a wonderful lunch. Thank you so much for sticking with us so far today. Without further ado, bearing in mind our time, we're going to move on with the next session. First and foremost, just to briefly remind you again of our rules of engagement. I'm not going to go through all of them, but briefly, just to remind you to use the Q&A tabs for your any discussions. Please do upvote whatever questions that there are, because we really want to answer as many as we can. And please, most importantly, try and keep questions as relevant to the session as you can. It's been brilliant so far with the questions. We've had the odd question that might have been out of place, but great work so far. So please do keep upvoting. And finally, please do complete any polls that we have. Brilliant. Thank you so much once again. This session, we're going to be discussing the assessments and reflective practice that as STPs are required of us. So without further ado, I extend a warm welcome to Namir Al Hasso, who's one of our STP Training Programme Directors. Mr. Hasso, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by saying welcome to all of you. You made it to being an STP, so just a warm welcome to you. You are going to be the future scientist for the NHS. So today I'm going to be talking to you about assessment in the workplace. And the aim of the session is basically to learn about the different types of the work-based assessment and how to work differently during COVID, a little bit about that. So generally assessments have a purpose. So why do we assess? So we don't assess to make you feel uncomfortable as a trainee, but we assess to make sure that you show evidence to show your training officer or your assessor that you are competent. The assessment exists to ensure that the assessor has some evidence that to show them that you are competent and can be signed off. And usually formal assessment of competency is often related to George Miller's pyramids, which you can see in front of you. So there's 4 stages of the pyramid. So starting from the bottom, the knows, how, the shows, and the does. However, recent discussions have added 2 extra levels or layers below the nose, so below the baseline, which is the 2 like pre-nose stages, which is the knows about and the heard of. If you think of the first 2 stages, the knows and the knows how, they can be assessed using traditional tools, and these traditional tools are usually written and oral assessment or tests. However, the knowing and knowing how stages do not, so that again the first 2 knows and knows how do not just kind of needs those kind of assessment. There are other kind of applications and stuff that you can use to cover those 2 layers. If you think of the level 3 and 4, so that's the shows and the does. So at these 2 levels, they kind of get a bit more challenging, they're more important. So to demonstrate a clinical competence, you need to do the top 2 layers, the shows and the does. If you think of the level 3, this shows how this can be assessed by doing a practical examination, by doing, for example, observed short or long cases, but also something similar to the OSFA or the OSCE. So the OSCE is the medical exam, the OSFA is the STP exit exam, which is the objective structured final assessment that we did before COVID. The level 4, which is the does, this can only be assessed by observing the trainee or the practitioner at work. Basically at that level, at level 4, you are measuring the trainee or the individual's ability to perform something. So if you think about it, it's like learning to drive. So you start with the theory of learning how to drive, and then you will give it a go in a simulated environment before you can show how at the practical test that you do to pass the test. And ultimately, once you pass the test, then you are at level 4, you're an expert. So a bit about competence and competency. So competence is the ability or qualification of an individual to do a job properly. However, competency is about demonstration of set of knowledge, skills, or experience, plus other attributes important to the job to do that job properly. So competence is an outcome, while competency is the input to achieve that task. And being competent means all the circles in front of you. So you need to, so if you start from the top, you need to understand why it should be done that particular way. You need to be able to apply knowledge and skills consistently. You need to be able to transfer skills to different situations and so on. As a trainee STP, obviously we in the national school, we have a web page that has all the curriculum for all the different disciplines. So your own discipline, if you go into the curriculum library, you can just go to Google and search. If you put NHS, National School of Healthcare Science and Curriculum Library, you will get the page with all the contents of the your own specialism. So it includes the core the core competency, the rotational competency, and the specialist module as well. I really find it useful. So in the past, I was a training officer, and this used to be really helpful to me. And even now in the school, I find it really helpful. There are different type of assessment that you can do in the workplace. And the first is just a list of them. So competencies, the DOPS, direct observation of practical skills, the OCEs, the observed clinical event, and finally the case-based discussions. So we'll talk about each one of them just now. So competencies, their purpose is to for you to upload them to to observe a performance of a skill or a procedure linked to one of your STP module based learning objectives. They can be requested. So you as a trainee, you request for them to take place, and you will be, so when you submit them, your training officer will get a notification that you've submitted a competency. They look at it and see your evidence and probably provide you with feedback and what things you can improve to, for the future. And obviously, this is a learning journey for you as a trainee. This is your first year, and obviously, as you progress in your training program, you get more confident in what kind of evidence you submit for competencies. And we always encourage you to sit with your training officer to discuss the level of competency or what is needed for this competency. I'm going to move to the next one, the DOPS, the direct observed practical skill. So the DOPS, again, they have a purpose, and the purpose is to observe and assess the conduct of a practical procedure. They are reviewed and documented in the moment as it is happening. And again, some examples for the DOPS is, for example, you can reflect on routine tasks in your own specialism, whether it's measuring the radiation output of a treatment machine, running a particular diagnostic test, or performing a sensory awareness test. Again, there's feedback generated at the end of them, and learning needs identified and an action plan generated. So that's why it's really important to have the regular discussion with your assessor or the training officer when you, at the end of submission, at the end of assessment by your assessor. The next one is the OCEs, observed clinical events. So the purpose of OCEs is to observe and assess a clinical encounter. They will be reviewed and documented again in the moment as it is happening. An example of this is taking a clinical history, discussing a problem of small field dosimetry, or explaining how to take a blood sample. The assessor will review the trainee's communication skills, clinical judgment, organization, and efficiency. Moving to the fourth type, CBDs, case-based discussions. So case-based discussions, they discuss an outcome or an output from a workplace activity using a record or result. They take place after a clinical event. So it's after rather than during. In the other previous two type of kind of competency assessments. And they are basically, as a trainee, you are discussing, explaining, or justifying an aspect of a science or the theory behind a process. So, for example, a report or result or something like that. So, as a training officer, they will be exploring decision making and the application of clinical knowledge of you, the trainee. But it can also include ethical and governance framework of that particular practice. I'm going to talk a bit about the multi-source feedback. This is something my colleague Jane mentioned earlier. So the multi-source feedback is a tool that is designed to collect information from colleagues that you worked with as a trainee. So whether they are colleagues in your own department or visiting the department that you visited during the first year rotations. And the idea behind it is to collect some kind of information about your clinical performance, your professional behavior, and then you can provide you as a trainee with some data to reflect on how you performed and how you can improve yourself. They usually happen in the NHS at some levels where NHS employee needs to do the so-called 360 appraisal. It's exactly the same thing. The information is gathered without you knowing who. So you nominate raters, if you like, and then they respond to you anonymously. That you don't know who put that comment or that feedback. But the whole idea behind it is for you to develop yourself and make sure that you are progressing in the right direction. As my colleague said, there's two multi-source feedback, one at 18 months and one at the end of the program. And again, the idea is you can produce some feedback that you can work on, and hopefully when you do it next time, you've seen the improvement that you have been able to take on board. A little bit about completing evidence during COVID. Obviously, COVID has affected everyone, affected us in the school, affected every single department, NHS Trust, organization, and everyone's kind of getting used to the new normal. And we're doing this induction day virtually. So we all had to find different ways of working. This new platform, the AirMeet, is a wonderful platform to create this event. And I think it's a really good idea to share practices if you have, or share good practices. In the past or in the previous years when COVID started, some disciplines in healthcare science really adapted really well, and some others not so well. But by learning from each other, so people learned from different disciplines how they did things. And I think it's really, again, going back to the networking with the trainees and networking with regional networks, even professional bodies network, is really helpful. We have some resources page on the school website. to kind of give you some ideas and some practices that you can use to kind of avoid the COVID challenges. But it's also something called the e-learning hub, which is a health education in England. So again, it's an NHS platform where you can use that platform to find some. There are some online courses that could be really beneficial for not every single discipline, but some disciplines found it really, really helpful. Where you can do these online courses rather than you have to go and visit a particular department. And finally, I think I've already mentioned the online resources on the school website. I'm going to talk a bit about reflective practice. Reflective practice is really important to show what has been learned. So I'm just going to give a simple example. If you say I've driven a car from point A to point B, so that's a factual statement. But if you're writing a reflective piece regarding this journey from A to B, is to say I've driven from A to B to go and see a patient. That journey has reflect on what the journey has. What have you learned from the journey? What have you? How did it make it easy, for example, for the patient? That the patient didn't have to come to the hospital, so you went to visit that patient. So it's all the elements involved in the journey from A to B. So what things that could go wrong, and how would you make the journey perfectly? Are the lessons that you've learned useful for yourself, the department, the patient? How would you improve it? How would you make it better? So you can reflect on things in many ways. There's also some in your professional body, or some professional bodies do have some guidance on how to reflect. So, for example, for my professional body, there were some kind of questions, set of five questions that you need to answer when you reflect. So, describe the action. How did you benefit from the action? What did you do to meet the action? How did it improve the patient? What did it do to the patient? How is it benefit the patient? What would you do differently? You can also reflect on your university work with evidence of the activity, for example, PowerPoint presentation, photos of peer-to-peer feedback, and so on. You could also reflect on a consultation, so especially if you're patient-facing discipline, you can reflect on that and how would you improve it and so on. You could also reflect on a visit to A&E, for example, to take patient history or to take patient consent. I think the last thing I've covered already, so you need to think of the challenges and how would you overcome them and make it a better experience in the future. So what makes a good evidence? So a good evidence is an evidence that demonstrates that you as a trainee has managed to meet the learning outcome of that competency. You can apply academic learning in clinical work-based context and linking the evidence to the frameworks and the literature and the best practice. So obviously you're going to university, you're doing MSc and doing some theory, but also there's the practical element that you do in your work. So because this is a postgraduate training program, it needs to be at level 7 learning. So evidence should be critically reflective. You have, as you mentioned previously, what happened, what did you learn, how would you kind of change it in the future, how would you improve it in the future, and so on. As a trainee, even if you're patient-facing or non-patient-facing trainee, you always have to think of the patient, because this STP training program is all about the NHS, about creating scientists for the NHS. So using patient feedback or satisfaction surveys, this could be included as part of your good evidence, and you can reflect on it. You can use evidence, like visual evidence, for example, photos, videos. You can also use diagrams, and I think I'm a fan of diagrams. I think when you submit anything as evidence, if you can put a diagram at the beginning, to give the kind of summary of the whole evidence that you submitted, and then you can describe the bit of paragraph at the end of it. So I think 10 pages of evidence is not probably what your training officer wants, but maybe half a page is, again, is not what your training officer wants. So keep it brief and to the point. But also discuss with your training officer when you start your training journey, what kind of evidence they expect from you. And again, as I said earlier, as you progress in your training journey, you will get more confident in your evidence and what kind of evidence you submit. So what to upload as evidence? So you need to think of it as not just a tick box, but it's not also a 10,000 word piece of work. Evidence needs to meet the competency outcome. Think about the competency that they are trying to demonstrate what you trying to demonstrate that it's safe and that it's just you add a bit of justification. And as I mentioned previously, you can add some videos and audios. Photographs you can use, but make sure you get permission. And I think, as Holly said in her presentation earlier this morning, that creating some videos in the department, there are some regulations that you have to go through first. What isn't right is you write in the evidence, my supervisor saw me doing this, or you put a 10-page extract from a standard textbook or an SOP in your department. You've got to think of plagiarism, so it's not acceptable to plagiarize. Everything has to be your own work, your own understanding of that particular competency. And you must demonstrate that you undertook the task and that you understood it. So idea for good evidence, in terms of general competency, a description of a problem or a clinical issue that you need to consider in your department, a case report, a treatment plan, analytical results. Obviously, you need to reference to academic papers or guidance documents about the condition. Evidence prepared for other purposes, for example, routine calibration audits can be used. And as you will see, that audits and quality control is a big part of all your the different disciplines in healthcare science. In terms of clinical competency, obviously, you need to be careful. You don't mention the patient, any identifiers for the patient, whether it's a name, date of birth, NHS number. So you can add test results. You can talk about management plan for the patient. You could evidence that understand the impact on the patient in terms of the treatment plan and the test. From a professional competency, obviously, as a trainee, to do a professional competency, we always encourage you, as Bernie mentioned and other colleagues mentioned this morning, that you go out and raise awareness of your specialism, healthcare science, and inspire others to be scientists. I mean, even now, you ask people, young school, if you go to schools and ask about scientists in the NHS, some people don't know there are scientists in the NHS. So again, this is part of your role as a trainee, to go out and talk about science, to become an ambassador. and spread the word. And I think someone previously talked about the STEM ambassador, which I think is really an important thing to do. Format types of good evidence. So obviously presentation, witness statements, reports, podcast, photographs, videos, and so on. Observation of patient interaction, feedback and surveys, attendance of training events and conferences. And again, there are lots of examples of good evidence. I think I also encourage you to speak to your senior peers, so STPs in year 2 or year 3 in your specialism, whether you have them in your department or in your trust. They would be really, they will give you an invaluable advice, I think. To summarize, so good evidence is clear, concise, and relevant to the specific competency or learning outcome. A good evidence is critically reflective on the task and processes involved. A good evidence demonstrates practically that the competency has been achieved. What have you done to kind of show feedback from colleagues and patients? Also, good evidence needs to take into account the implication for the patient. And again, you need to put the patient at the focus of your training, whether you're a patient-facing or whether you're not a patient-facing. Even if you're not a patient-facing, like myself, my background is genomics and hematology, and I deal with test tubes or DNA tubes. But it's important to realize this is a patient behind that tube or piece of report that you write a report at the end of the test. Finally, shows that you are an evidence-based practitioner. So evidence-based practice is really important for a scientist. It needs to show that you are applying academic learning and using frameworks and the best practice guidelines in the clinical context. And I'm sure in your discipline, there is some best practice guidelines. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take some answers and questions.
Right. Many thanks, Namir, for that. We'll go straight on to the questions. There are many coming in. First is from Dan Martin. Are examples available of previously submitted competencies with good amounts for reflection that we as students can use as a framework?
So I think on our website, there are some examples of CBDs, case-based discussions, a bit of reflection. I've noticed that Jazz put some links on the agenda. So for you to click on, and that will take you to the school website to look at some examples. But I think we, as a school, we always encourage training officers in department to share these with us, because we can't put them on the website if they're not been kind of given to us by the departmental trainees.
Brilliant. Thank you, Namir. Next one from Rebecca in London. One moment. Yes, sorry, Namir, if you could kindly unshare your screen.
Absolutely,
yes. So our next question, how can we achieve a competency when our department does not carry out a specific specialist test?
So that's simple. I think if there is a specialist test, assuming that your department will be sending you to the specialist laboratory that they do that particular test, I think it's part of the accreditation when the department is accredited that they need to meet all the components of the of your own curriculum. So if you don't do that particular test, then you need to arrange a visit or rotation into that specialist laboratory to do that test.
Brilliant. Thank you. We'll look at a couple more questions. This one from Charlotte. If we get a photograph which includes a patient procedure, is verbal consent enough, or do we need to produce a consent form? Good question.
That's a very good question. I mean, if it was me, I would definitely put something in the evidence that you have obtained consent. I would personally put a consent form as part of the evidence, because I think if there's any assessors, probably they would be asking for it anyway to see that consent.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we will end it there. Oh, sorry, one more. We'll take one more from Katie, and then we'll call it a day. I've been working as a BMS, and I've done some evidence pieces for my specialist portfolio.
Mhm.
Can these be adapted to my new role and included as evidence?
So, Katie, it's a good question. I think it depends on the competency. I think if I can't remember exactly if the specialist portfolio is a postgraduate level. I think it is. So the level of evidence that you submit for your STP needs to be at level 7. So if it meets that level and within the kind of short, I mean, it's not like 5 years ago. It needs to be, reasonable time frame. So if you've done it maybe 6 months ago, maybe that would be acceptable. But if you've done it 6 years ago, then probably it's not acceptable. But it's your training officer that needs to, or the assessor needs to be happy with the evidence before they can sign it off.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Namir, thank you for taking us through a topic that obviously is very key to our progression through the STP. And to you, trainees, thank you for your patience. We could have discussed this all day, but obviously we have a timetable to keep to. So thank you for your patience. And with that, we want to thank you once again for your time. And if you do have any more questions, please do keep them coming in through the Q&A or contact the school at a later date. And all be well. We'll see you at the next session. Thank you, guys. Have a good afternoon.